Good evening and welcome to Postmark Filmworks series, Our Bridges, Stories from When. I'm Deborah Cathryn, your host. I'm a Campbell County artist and a board member of Postmark. Our regular format for this series begins with a short reading from literature. Tonight's selection is from Chapter 5, Moonshine Land, from the book Our Southern Highlanders, written by Horace Kephart and first published by the Outing Publishing Company in the year 1913. Horace Kephart was born on September 8, 1862, while the American Civil War was raging, and he died April 2, 1931. He was an American travel writer and librarian who loved the rugged wilderness, and he wrote classic outdoors guides to camping and woodcraft. He spent several years traveling around southern Appalachia and in the Smoky Mountains, and he lived in what would later become the Hazel Creek section of the Smoky Mountains National Park. Kephart suffered a nervous breakdown, depression, tuberculosis, and alcoholism, eventually dying in an automobile accident. He assisted in establishing the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and assisted in planning for the Appalachian Trail. Mount Kephart in Sevier County is named after him. Let us begin. Chapter 5, Moonshine Land. I was hunting alone in the mountains and exploring ground that was new to me. About noon, while descending from a high ridge into a creek valley to get some water, I became enmeshed in a rhododendron slick and to some extent lost my bearings. After floundering about for an hour or two, I suddenly came out upon a little clearing. Giant hemlocks, girdled and gaunt, rose from a steep cornfield of 5 acres, beyond which loomed the primeval forest of the Great Smoky Mountains. Squat in the foreground sat a tiny one-room shack. A thin curl of smoke rose from one end of the cabin. Within the hut, I found only a slip of a girl rocking a baby almost as big as herself and trying to knit a sock at the same time. She was toasting her bare toes before the fire. I shivered as I looked around, comparing her only garment, a torn calico dress, with my own stout hunter's garb that seemed none too warm for such a day as this. Knowing that the sudden appearance of a stranger would startle the girl, I chose the quickest way to reassure her by saluting in the vernacular. "Howdy!" "Howdy?" she gasped. "Who lives here?" "Tom Kirby." "Kirby? Oh, yes, I know him. We've been hunting together. Is your father at home?" "No, he's out somewheres." "Where's your mother?" "She's in the field up yon, getting roughness." I took some pride in not being stumped by this answer. Roughness, in mountain lingo, is any kind of rough fodder, specifically corn fodder. "How far is it to the next house?" "I don't know. Ma, she knows." "All right, I'll find her." I went up to the field. No one was in sight, but a shock of fodder was walking away from me, and I conjectured that Ma's feet were under it. So I hailed, "Hello!" The shock turned around, then tumbled over, and there stood revealed a bare-headed, bare-footed woman, coarse-featured, but of superb physique. One of those mountain giantesses who think nothing of shouldering a 2-bushel sack of corn and carrying it a mile or two without letting it down. She flushed, then paled, staring at me round-eyed. Frightened, I thought. However, Mistress Kirby quickly recovered her aplomb. Her mouth straightened to a thin slit. She planted herself squarely across my path, now regarding me with contracted lids and a hard glint, till I felt fairly bayoneted by those steel gray eyes. "Good morning. Is Mr. Kirby about?" I inquired. There was no answer. Instead, the thin slit opened and yet let out a yell of almost yodel quality, penetrating as a war whoop, a yell that would carry near half a mile. I wondered what she meant by this, but she did not enlighten me by so much as a single word. It was puzzling, not to say disconcerting, but charging it to the custom of a country that was still new to me, I found my tongue again and started to give credentials. "My name is Kephart. I am staying at the Everett Mine on Sugar Fork." Another yell that set the wild echoes flying. "I'm acquainted with your husband. We've hunted together. Perhaps he has told you." Yell number 3, same pitch and vigor as before. By this time, I was quite nonplussed. I waited for her to speak, but never a word did the woman deign. So there we stood and stared at each other in silence. I, leaning on my rifle, she with arms akimbo, till I grew embarrassed, half wondering, too, if the creature were demented. Suddenly a light flashed upon my groping wits. This Amazon was on picket. Her 3 shrieks had been a signal to someone up the branch. Her attitude showed that there was no thoroughfare in that direction at present. Circumstances, whatever they were, forbade explanation. Clearly, the woman thought that I could not help seeing how matters stood. She considered that if I was what I claimed to be, an acquaintance of her husband, and on friendly footing, I would be gentleman enough to retire. If I was something else, an officer, a spy, well, she was there to stop me until the captain of the guard arrived. Ah, well, I remarked, when your husband gets back, tell him, please, that I was sorry to miss him, though I did not call in any special business. Just wanted to say howdy, you know, good day. I turned and went down the valley. All the way home, I speculated on this. What was going on up yon? A month before, when I had started for this wildest nook of the Smokies, a friend had intimated that I was venturing into a dubious district, Moonshine land. My only fear had been that I might not find any moonshiners, or, having found them, I might not succeed in winning their confidence to the extent of learning their own side of an interesting story. And now it seemed as if luck had indeed favored me with an excuse for broaching the topic to some friendly mountaineer. I had no more than finished supper that evening when a man called at my lonely cabin. He was the one that I knew best among my scattered neighbors. I gave him a rather humorous account of my reception by Madame Kirby and asked him what he thought she was yelling about. There was no answering smile on my visitor's face. He pondered in silence and ventured no more than a helpless, "Well, now I wonder." It did not suit me to let the matter go at that. So on a sudden impulse, I fired the question point blank at him. "Do you suppose that Tom is running a still up there at the head of that little cove?" The man's face hardened, and there came a glint into his eyes, such as I had noticed in Mistress Kirby's. "Judgmatically, I don't know." Well, excuse me, I don't want to know either. But let me explain just what I am driving at. People up north, and in the lowlands of the south as well, have a notion that there's little or nothing going on in these mountains except feuds and moonshining. They think that a stranger traveling here alone is in danger of being potted by a bullet from almost any laurel thicket that he passes, on mere suspicion that he may be a revenue officer or a spy. Of course, that is nonsense, but there is one thing that I'm as ignorant about as any other novel reader of them all. You know my habits. I like to explore. I never take a guide. And when I come to a place that's particularly wild and primitive, that's just the place I want to peer into. Now, the dubious point is this. Suppose that one of these days when I'm out hunting or looking for rare plants, I should stumble upon a moonshine still in full operation. Well, what would happen? What would they do? Well, sir, I'll tell you what they'd do. They'd first place ask you some questions about yourself and what you was doing in that there neck of the woods. Then they'd get you to do some trifling work about the still, feed the furnace or stir the mash, just so they could prove you took a hand in it your own self. Well, what good would that do? It would make you one of them in the eyes of the law. I see, but really doesn't that seem rather childish? I could easily convince any court that I did it under compulsion, for that's what it would amount to. I reckon you uns would find a United States court pretty hard to convince. The judge would write up and want to know why you let grass grow to seed before you came and informed on them. He paused, watched my expression, and then continued quizzically. I reckon you wouldn't be in no great hurry to do that. No. Then if I stirred the mash and sampled their liquor, nobody would be likely to mistreat me? Well, shucks, why, man, what could they gain by hurting you? at the WASP, supposing they was convinced by your own evidence. Well, they'd only get a month or two in the pen. So why should they murder you and get hung for it? It's all tarnal foolishness, the notion some folks has. I thought so. Now here, the public's been fed all sorts of nonsense about this moonshine business. I'd like to learn the plain truth about it, especially how it is regarded from the mountain people's own point of view. I have already learned that a stranger's life and property are safer here than they would be on the streets of Chicago or St. Louis. It will do your country good to have that known. But I can't say that there's no moonshining going on here, for a man with a wooden nose could smell it. Now, what is your excuse for defying the law? You don't seem ashamed of it. The man's face turned an angry red. Mister, we ain't got no call to be ashamed of ourselves, nor of everything we do. We're poor, but we don't ask no favors. We stay way up here in East Coast and mind our own business. When a stranger comes along, he's welcome to the best we've got, such as 'tis. But if he imposes on us, he gets his medicine pretty darn quick. And you think the government tax on whiskey is an imposition? It is, under some circumstances. My guest stretched his legs and judgmatically proceeded to enlighten me. There's plenty of men and women grown in these mountains who don't know that the government is everything, but a president in a biled shirt who commands 2-3 judges and a gang of revenue officers. They know there's a president because the men folks voted for him, and the women folks see this picture. They've heard tell about the judges, and they've seen the revenuers in flesh and blood. They believe in supporting the government because it's the law. Nobody refuses to pay his taxes, for taxes is fair and square. Taxes cost maybe 3 cents on the dollar, and that's all right. But revenue costs $1.10 on 20 cents worth of liquor, and that's robbing the people with a gun to their faces. Of course, I ain't so ignorant as all that. I've traveled about the country, been to Asheville once, and to Waynesville a heap of times, and I know the theory. Theory says the revenue is a tax on luxury. Well, that's all right, anything in reason. The big fellers that make lots of money out of stilling and living in luxury ought to pay handsome for it. But whoever's seen luxury cavorting around in these Smoky Mountains? My friend continued. Whiskey means more to us mountain folks than it does to folks in town, where there's drugstores and doctors. Let everything go wrong in the family, fever or snake bite or something, and we can't get a doctor up here less than 3 days, and it costs scandalous. The only medicines we has is herbs, which customarily ain't no good without a little grain of whiskey. Now there ain't no saloons allowed in all these western counties. The nighest state dispensary even is 60 miles away. The law want us to have liquor shipped to us from anywhere in the state. If we get it sent to us from outside the state, it has to come by express. And regular old popskull it is too. So to be good law-abiding citizens, we-uns must travel back and forth at a heap of expense or pay express rates on poison liquor. And we're too darn poor to do any of that. We're just too darn poor. Now yon's my field of corn. I gather the corn, shuck it, grind it my own self, and the woman she bakes us pone bread to eat. And I don't pay no tax, do I? Then why can't I make some of my corn into pure whiskey to drink without paying tax? I tell you, 'tain't fair, this way the government does. But when all is said and done, the main reason for this moonshining, as you uns call it, is bad roads. Bad roads, I exclaimed. What the? Just this away. From here to the railroad is 17 miles, with 2 mountains to cross. And you've seen that road. I recollect Ewans said every one of them miles was 1,000 rods long. Nobody's ever measured them except by mountain man's foot rule, big feet, and a long stride between them. 700 pounds is all the load a good team can haul over that road when the weather's good. It takes 3 days to make the round trip, less than you're breaking an axle, then it takes 4. When you do get to the railroad, there ain't no town of 1,000 people within 50 miles. Now us folks ain't even got wagons. There's only one serviceable wagon in this whole settlement, and you can't hire it without a team and driver, which is $2.50 a day. Where one of our little sleds can't go, we have to pack on muleback or tussle it on our own wethers. Look then, the only farm produce we can sell is corn. You see for yourself that corn can't be shipped out in here. We can trade it for store credit, that's all. Corn juice is about all we can tote around over the country and get cash money for. Why, man, that's the only way some folks has of paying their taxes. But aside from the work and the worry, I remarked, there's the danger of being shot in this business. Oh, we don't lay that up agin the government. It's as fair for one as 'tis for t'other. When a revenuer comes sneaking round, why, what he gets, or what we gets, that's the fortune of war, as the old saying is. I fancy that some gentlemen will stare at the words here, but I am stating facts.
But the one thing I remember the most, and my mom told this story all the time, my dad would take an old car, him and my papa would go somewhere in the Briceville Mountains, pick up moonshine. I didn't know it was moonshine. I didn't even know what it was. It was in these big jars, and the trunk would be full of them. Well, Dad started heading out where he's going with them. Of course, cops got after him. I guess it was the cops. I never saw police uniforms, so I'm not sure what kind of people they were. We just know they chased Daddy all the time. But it was common knowledge, my mom would say, common as 2 or 3 times a week. They'd chase Dad, and of course Dad would head home. If he could get home, they wouldn't get him. But as soon as he pulled up in the driveway, he'd come running through the front door and out the back door. And here come these guys right behind him, chasing him. And they'd go through the living room, and my mom was sitting on the couch, and they'd say, "Hey, Miss Sexton, keep right on running." She goes, "He went out the back door." Well, most of the time they didn't catch him, because once he got in the woods, it was history. But every now and then, we'd see him, get him, take him and put him in a car and leave him. We were just so tiny that, "Where's Daddy going, Mom?" "He'll be back." So that was my experience with moonshine, other than the time when Dad had a whole bunch of it sitting around in glasses, and I was just a little bitty thing. Didn't know what it was, so I picked up one of them big glasses and drank it. Needless to say, that's the last time I ever tasted moonshine.
Moonshine was common in Campbell County, and I guess any county in East Tennessee when I was growing up. We didn't have it in our house, or anything like that, but everybody knew somebody that did. And, most everybody I knew had relatives that kept it in their houses. I never knew anybody that sold it, and I suspect most people that made moonshine didn't sell it. They kept it for themselves and family and friends. But I had people I knew, people my parents knew, and relatives that always had some. And on a few occasions, I'd encounter it and didn't think much about it really, but I had a relative that always kept some, and it was usually in a jug, and it was brought out for special occasions. Well, I was young and inquisitive, and I noticed that, there was a group of men that were sampling some, so I was curious, wondered what it was, and so I asked my relative, I said, well, what is that? He said, well, this is snake bite medicine. Well, I was young and naive, and I said, oh my gosh, did you get bitten by a snake? He said, no, but you never can tell. Well, that let me know that it really wasn't for medicinal purposes, although it wouldn't have surprised me if somebody that had been drinking it got bitten by a snake. If the snake swelled up and died, that wouldn't have surprised me at all, because, again, being a curious kid, I said, well, can I taste it? And so he put a little bit in a cap there, and I stuck my tongue to it, and my tongue just went numb. I didn't swallow it. If your tongue goes numb, that's a bad sign. So I said, that's awful. That's the worst tasting stuff ever. What possible purpose does that serve? Of course, I didn't say it that way because my tongue was numb. So I was more like, well, that's the worst thing I've ever tasted in my life. And he knew what I said. So he said, well, I'll tell you one good use for it. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, it's real good for taking rust off a chrome bumper. Well, I never knew why on earth anybody would want to drink something that would take rust off a chrome bumper. And again, I don't know if he was serious or not, but I suspect he was. And he showed me why they called it white lightning. I hadn't heard that phrase really at that age. Later on, I did, of course, movies like Thunder Road and Robert Mitchum and all that. But the way you tested moonshine to see how good it was, they called it flashing. And you'd take it in the jug, a clear jug, and shake it, to give it a real good shake. And when you did, it bubbled, and it turned kind of a white. It looked white for a few moments till the bubbles settled back out of it. And the more that it flashed, the higher the proof was, octane. Ideally, moonshine was 200 proof. I found out much later. And I also didn't know until many years later that whiskey starts off as moonshine. You put it in an oak casket, that's cask, and age it, and that's what turns it into whiskey. But he showed me and flashed it, and it just turned as white as could be for just a few seconds, and then it settled back out. And he said, this is good, And I'd heard rumors that you could pour it in the tank of your car and drive off, but I don't know if that's actually true or not. But again, it wouldn't surprise me. But, it was just considered a cultural thing, and in the Campbell County I grew up in their minds, I think people made a distinction between those that sold it on a large scale and those that just kept it around for medicinal purposes or whatever. And it seems like the local law enforcement usually went after the large producers. I don't recall anybody ever being arrested because they had one jug in their kitchen or whatever, But the ones they went after, they'd make a big show of it. And just about every week there when I was a kid, the local press would have a picture of some still that they'd drug out of the mountains somewhere, and they'd make a big show of taking an axe to it and banging it up and splitting it and pouring out some moonshine, and show what a good job they were doing. It was, I guess, a much more innocent time when that was, the big thing people went after. That was my generation's, I guess, drugs as far as law enforcement was concerned. Of course, this was back at a time when the Campbell County Jail averaged about 6 or 8 people as inmates. So I guess there wasn't a whole lot going on, so they went after moonshine. And of course the feds federal folks, they come in and went after it for failure to pay taxes, and they would go after it, called them revenuers, and they'd get out and prowl around. But it was rare for them to find much in this area because there weren't really, I don't think, any big producers. They just, some people did sell it, but most of them I knew just gave it away, and it was just part of the culture. You know, you didn't think much about it, and people would talk about it, or you'd go to somebody's home and see the grown-ups, maybe men, you know, off somewhere smoking their cigars and taking a nip of it. My one taste of it was enough to discourage me. I never wanted anything to do with it, and never did. Haven't seen any in 40 years, but I think it's about gone now. But it was, you know, it was an important part of our history. It went all the way back to colonial times when they had to find an economical way to transport corn to markets to make money, and liquefying it was the most ideal way to realize a rate of return, because if all you've got's one cart, you know, and a horse to pull it, then you can't make much money throwing ears of corn in. But if you can stack jugs of liquid corn in there, then they could make money. So, you know, it was a cultural thing, I guess, that was inbred, you know, deeply in the from colonial times. But that was about the only encounter I ever had with it, other than just seeing it at a distance and reading about it in the papers.